Wyoming Territory, July 1879. The sun was barely over the ragged peaks when Vernon Lattimer snapped the reins and drove his wagon hard through the sagebrush flats, leaving behind the town of Red Butte and the woman who had promised to marry him, then changed her mind 2 days before the wedding. Dust curled behind the wheels. A tin coffee pot swung from its hook. Vernon's jaw was locked tight, his shoulders stiff beneath his worn canvas coat. He did not look back. He had no reason to. Love had fooled him once. That was enough. The wagon creaked and clattered across the open land. His 2 boys, Gideon, 8, and Garrett, 5, sat silent in the back, wrapped in a blanket despite the summer heat. Their mother had died 3 winters ago when fever swept through their old homestead out near Fort Laramie. Vernon had buried her with his own hands and sworn to raise the boys alone. He had not planned on marrying again until Clara came along with her soft voice and Sunday dresses and sweet talk about building a new life together. She had changed her mind. Said she was not meant to raise another woman's children, so Vernon drove west. He did not have a destination in mind, only the need to move, to get beyond the reach of that small town and the pitying looks. By the 3rd morning, he found himself on the edge of the Bighorn Basin, where the cottonwoods grew taller and the river spoke louder. It was there, on the cracked trail near a wooden footbridge, that he saw her. A woman in a ruined ivory dress sat crumpled beneath a juniper tree, her knees drawn up, her back against the trunk. Her hair, once done up, hung in loose curls down her back. Her boots were dust-caked. She looked like she had not moved in hours. Vernon pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. His boys peered over the side. "You all right, ma'am?" he called. She lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed but steady. "Do I look all right?" He stepped closer. "You hurt?" "No. Just humiliated." She stood slowly, brushing her skirt off with both hands. "I was supposed to be married yesterday." Vernon looked at the torn hem of her dress. "He leave you out here?" "He left me at the altar," she said. "I left myself out here." He glanced back at his wagon, then at her. "This is no place to be alone. I am not looking for help. Does not mean you do not need it." She hesitated, her chin lifting. "My name is Rosalie Finch. My father's ranch is 2 days east past the bluffs. I took a buggy and made it 1 day out before I gave up trying to pretend I was fine." He nodded once. "Vernon Lattimer, this is Gideon and Garrett." The boys gave shy nods. Rosalie's face softened as she looked at them. "They have your eyes. They have their mother's stubbornness." Something passed between them, then quiet but real, a flicker of understanding. Loss had shaped both of them. Vernon turned. "We are heading west, but I can take you home." "I am not going back," she said quickly. "If I do, I will be the rejected bride everyone whispers about for the rest of my life." He studied her a moment longer. "Then where are you going?" "I do not know yet," she answered, eyes steady. He nodded. "Well, you can ride with us until you figure it out." Rosalie hesitated, then looked at the boys again. Garrett had his thumb near his mouth and Gideon was squinting at her like he was trying to decide if he liked her. "I would be grateful," she said quietly. Vernon helped her up into the wagon. They rode in silence most of that morning. Rosalie held Garrett on her lap when he got restless and helped pass bread and jerky around when they stopped to eat. Vernon watched her from the corner of his eye. She did not cry. She did not complain. She just sat straight and quiet, her hands folded in her lap, staring out at the horizon like she was looking for something to hold onto. That night, they camped near a bend in the river. Vernon made the fire while the boys gathered dry kindling. Rosalie helped without being asked. She fetched water, laid out clean cloth for supper, and mended a rip in Gideon's sleeve with thread from her skirt hem. After the boys fell asleep, Vernon sat across the fire from her. "You ever been west of here?" he asked. "No, scares you?" She looked at him. "No, not anymore. I think I was more scared staying." He nodded slowly. "That man you were supposed to marry, did he say why?" He said I was not what he wanted, that I was too strong-minded, too quick to speak. And he did not like that I wanted to teach at the schoolhouse after we married. Vernon leaned forward, hands around his coffee tin. "He sounds like a fool." Rosalie blinked, then smiled just a little. Vernon looked down into the fire. "My wife, her name was Alma. She was quiet but strong. She would have liked you." Rosalie pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. You loved her, he nodded. Still do, but she is gone, and life keeps going, she nodded back. Yes, it does. The fire crackled in the silence between them. The next day, Rosalie rode up front with Vernon. She asked about the horses, about the land, about how he managed with 2 boys on his own. He answered each question plainly, and after a while he started asking her things too. Where she learned to sew, what books she liked, why she wanted to teach. Her voice was steady when she spoke, but sometimes her fingers twisted in her skirt when she thought he was not looking. 2 nights later, a storm rolled in fast. The wind howled through the basin and rain pounded down, turning the trail to mud. One of the wagon wheels cracked in a rut. Vernon cursed under his breath and jumped down, soaked through in seconds. Rosalie was beside him before he could say a word. You get the boys under cover, she said, grabbing the lantern. I will hold the light. He hesitated, then nodded. She held the light steady for over an hour, never flinching. When the wheel was mended, Vernon looked up at her, soaked and shivering, her hair plastered to her cheeks. You all right? He asked. She nodded. Are you? He stared at her for a long beat. Something shifted in his chest, something he had not felt in years. The next morning, the sun came back. The trail dried. The wagon rolled on, and Vernon, for the first time in a long time, felt something more than just the weight of getting by. He felt hope, and it was sitting right beside him. By the 7th day, the land began to rise, the sage giving way to scattered pine and rock shadowed draws. The wagon creaked uphill through the foothills of the Absarokas, where snow still clung to the high ridges, even in July. The boys were quieter there, their eyes wide with the hush of tall trees and the unfamiliar hush that came with them. Rosalie had taken to riding up front each morning, her skirts tucked neatly beneath her and her hands resting in her lap, unless she was pointing something out to Garrett, who liked to sit between them when the trail allowed. This part of the country, she said one afternoon as they crested a slope, it feels like it doesn't want to be settled. Vernon adjusted the reins, his gaze fixed on the winding trail ahead. It doesn't, not really, but folks try anyway. Rosalie tilted her head toward the tree line. You think we'll find a place that fits? He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't just about land. When they made camp that night, farther up the slope where the river narrowed and ran fast, Vernon took the rifle and went out for grouse. The boys were collecting pine cones for the fire, Rosalie kneeling with them, showing them how to sort the green ones from the dry. When he returned with 2 birds slung from his belt, he caught her mid-laugh, head tilted, eyes bright, a streak of sap across her wrist. It caught him off guard, how natural it looked. Like she belonged to them already without needing to ask. After supper, Vernon set about scraping the hides for drying, and Rosalie sat on a flat stone nearby, mending one of Garrett's socks with a patience Vernon had never managed. The boys fell asleep early, cheeks flushed from sun and wind. Rosalie watched Vernon slice the last bit of flesh from the inside of the skin. You ever think of settling again? He wiped the blade clean before answering. I think about what the boys need. A sturdy roof. A school, maybe. A place they can grow into. You don't answer what you need, she said, not unkindly. He looked into the fire. I don't think about myself much anymore. She didn't press, only folded the sock and laid it beside his pack. Later, when the stars thickened above them, Vernon stood by the edge of the river. The current was loud here, carving fast and cold through stone. Rosalie stepped up beside him, arms wrapped around herself. Do you think there's a difference between being alone and being left behind? She asked. He glanced at her, then back to the water. I used to think no, now I'm not sure. I used to be afraid of what people thought, she said. Now I'm more afraid of becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. You're not that kind of woman. You don't know me that well. I know enough, he said. She didn't smile, but her expression changed, less guarded, more certain. We passed an old hand-built corral a few miles back, she said. Fallen down but not forgotten. Someone started a place out here once. He nodded. Most give up before the second winter, but some stay. He looked at her then, really looked. Some do. The next morning, Rosalie didn't take her place on the wagon bench right away. She lifted Garrett up, then Gideon, then climbed up herself, hands steady. Vernon waited until the trail widened before he spoke. There's a lake west of here, spring-fed. I passed it years back driving cattle north, lands flat enough to build, waters clean, games fair. She didn't answer right away. You thinking of settling? I'm thinking of what the boys need. She turned toward him, her voice low but sure. And what about you? This time he didn't look away. I'm thinking it wouldn't be so hard. If it was with someone who didn't scare off easy. The wagon bounced over a rut and steadied again. Rosalie set her hand lightly on the edge of the seat between them, not touching his, but close enough. I don't scare easy, she said. He nodded once, eyes on the trail. Good. Nothing more was said, but the space between them no longer felt like distance. By dusk, they saw the lake. It was quiet, ringed with pine, the water dark and still. Vernon pulled the wagon beneath a rise of rock where the ground flattened and the soil held promise. He stepped down, then helped Rosalie down with a hand to her waist. She didn't pull away. The boys ran toward the shore, laughing, shoes in hand. Rosalie stood beside Vernon, wind lifting strands of her hair. It's more than I pictured. It's not much yet. It's enough, she said. He looked at her. You thinking of staying? She looked back at him, the weight of it all in her eyes. I'm thinking there's nowhere else I'd rather try. He reached for her hand, and this time she met his without hesitation. The wind moved through the trees, and the boys' laughter echoed across the water. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows that didn't feel so heavy anymore. They stood together, not speaking, but aligned, two people who'd walked away from heartbreak, only to find something steadier in its place. 2 weeks passed beneath the sweep of open sky. Days filled with labor clearing brush, digging post holes, hauling stone from the creek, and nights marked by a quiet not found in towns. The lake, nestled in the arms of low ridges, held their sounds close. A boy's laughter, the creak of pine and wind, the hush of voices shared by firelight. Rosalie rose with the boys each morning now, helping them dress, braiding back their hair, teaching them to count fence rails and spell out words from a worn reader she had taken from the bottom of her trunk. Vernon watched her between tasks, noting how she moved through their routines without hesitation, like she'd belonged here longer than she had. One morning, as Vernon drove the team toward a stand of aspen to cut kindling, Rosalie followed on foot, a sack slung over her shoulder, full of laundry to wash in the cold stream trickling through the north edge of the meadow. You always carry more than your share, he said, glancing back at her. She shifted the strap across her shoulder. I don't see the use in standing still, not when there's things to be done. You ever let yourself rest? She looked up at him. Only when I've earned it. They made camp beneath the aspens that evening, too far from the lake to return before dark. Gideon and Garrett fell asleep curled beside the fire, wrapped in the wool blankets Rosalie had washed and dried that afternoon over flat sun-warmed rocks. As the light faded, Vernon sat against a fallen log, legs stretched, knife in hand, whittling a narrow strip of pine. Rosalie sat nearby, darning a tear in her shawl with an iron needle and what thread she had left. You were a different woman when I found you under that tree, he said after a long silence. I was a woman who didn't know where to put her anger, she replied, eyes on her stitching. He nodded once. You've found a place for it now. I've worn most of it down with work, she said, then glanced at him. Some of it I left behind on purpose. He set down the carving. Why's that? Because I don't want bitterness making choices for me. The fire snapped between them. A breeze moved through the trees, lifting the scent of pine and smoke. Vernon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I've been thinking on building a cabin before the snow comes down too hard, he said. Something with a loft for the boys. Room enough to bring in the stove from the wagon before winter. Rosalie folded her shawl and set it in her lap. You'd need help raising the frame. 4 hands won't be enough. I figured I'd ride south next week. There's a rancher near Owl Creek who hires out a man or two when the season slows. Might trade work for pelts or grain if I can find some, she nodded. I'll stay with the boys, he hesitated. You sure? They know me well enough now, I'll keep them safe. He studied her in the firelight. I don't just trust anyone with them, I know, she said. But you trust me, he nodded once. I do. That night, as she settled the blankets over the boys and lay beside them, Vernon remained at the fire, watching the stars drift behind the branches. He thought of the cabin, its walls, the roofline, the windows he'd carved to let in the morning light. But mostly, he thought of the woman sleeping a few feet away and how she'd begun to shape his days without ever asking to. He left before dawn, riding out with a rifle, a sack of dried meat, and 2 pelts. The trip took 5 days round. When he returned, he found the fire still burning, the boys fed and clean, and Rosalie out by the lake, hanging herbs to dry from a line of willow twine she'd strung between 2 posts. Garrett ran to him first, arms up. "We caught frogs," Gideon followed, holding a small bundle of feathers bound with twine. "Miss Rosalie showed us how to make a wind charm. She says it keeps bad dreams away." Vernon lifted Garrett to his hip and looked toward the lake where Rosalie stood, sleeves rolled, hair tied back in a scarf, eyes already seeking him out. When she reached him, she didn't speak right away. She simply touched his arm and looked at his face, as if checking he'd come back whole. He held her gaze. "Got 2 men coming in 3 days. They'll stay through the framework," she nodded. "Then we've got work to do." He glanced down at the charm in Gideon's hand. "You believe in things like that?" Rosalie bent to touch the feathers. "I believe in giving boys something to hold on to when the nights get long." That evening, Vernon took out the carving he'd been shaping before he left. It was a small horse, rough yet recognizable. He handed it to Garrett without a word, and the boy cradled it like a treasure. Rosalie stood nearby, watching the exchange. "You made that before you left, took it with me, finished it on the road." She brushed her hands on her skirt. "I've never met a man who carved toys for his children. I never met a woman who tells stories that make them forget their hurt." She folded her arms across her chest, half-smile forming as she looked at the boys. "Then maybe you and I make a fine enough match for them." Vernon watched her a long moment. "Maybe we do." No more needed saying. The wind-charmed feathers stirred in the breeze, and the last light of day stretched across the water, catching on the surface like a promise. The cabin rose slowly from the earth, its walls notched and stacked with rough pine, sap still fresh in the bark. By late August, the frame stood complete, timbers dark against the pale sky. Rosalie helped where she could, hauling stones for the hearth, grinding lye soap out near the creek, tending to the boys when splinters or bee stings sent them hollering. The 2 men Vernon hired stayed true to their word, working sunup to sundown without complaint. They left the morning after the roof was laid, quiet men who tipped their hats to Rosalie and promised the ridge would hold through winter. That evening, Vernon stood in the doorway of the nearly finished cabin. The wind had taken a turn cooler, coming down off the peaks with the smell of snow hidden somewhere above. He had spent most of the day digging a trench for runoff, his shoulders aching, palms raw beneath calloused skin. Rosalie came up behind him with a basin of water and a cloth. He didn't turn, but he stepped aside to let her through. "You've got pine sap in your hair," she said, setting the basin on the table he'd built from a split oak slab. "Hope that's all," he muttered, running a hand through the back of his neck. She dipped the cloth and reached up without asking, wiping carefully at the edge of his hairline. Her touch was gentle but sure. When she stepped back, her fingers lingered a moment at his temple. "You should rest," she said. "Not much time for that. Winter'll come down fast." "I didn't say stop. I said rest." He looked at her then. The fire behind her cast a long glow along the floorboards. She'd taken to wearing the same cotton dress most days, the one with the faded cuffs and a missing button at the throat. It didn't matter. Nothing about her felt lacking. "I thought about asking you something," he said. She didn't move, but her eyes steadied. "Then ask." He shifted his weight, not out of nerves, but care. "When I ride down to the settlement next week for seed, I'll need to register this land under a name. I was going to put mine." "You were," she said softly. "I'd like to put yours next to it." "If you'd agree to that." She looked down, then out the open door, where the boys were throwing stones into the shallows, their voices echoing off the far bank. "That's not just a name on paper, Vernon. I know. I've had proposals before. I reckon none of them came with a roof you helped raise." That earned a breath from her, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. She looked back at him, something quiet and full in her eyes. "You want a wife, not just a helpmate. I want what this already is. I want it steady, right?" She didn't answer right away. She stepped past him, out onto the porch, arms crossed loosely. The boys were making a game of balancing on a driftwood log, taking turns pushing each other off into the gravel. She watched them until Garrett tripped and Gideon offered a hand without being told. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life proving I wasn't broken," she said. "Now I just want to build something that lasts." Vernon stepped up beside her. "Then build it with me," she looked at him. "I will." They didn't speak more than that. They didn't need to. 3 days later, they rose early, Rosalie helping the boys dress while Vernon hitched the team. The ride to the settlement took them past low hills and through a gully where wild rose grew in thick patches. The town itself was no more than a cluster of wooden buildings, a mercantile, a smithy, a church with its door propped open. Vernon filled out the land claim while Rosalie sat with the boys under the cottonwood near the well. When he returned, he handed her the folded paper. She opened it. Her name was there, written beside his, the ink still damp. The preacher was a man Vernon had known from his cattle-driving days, a quiet fellow with a lined face and hands that shook when he held a book. They stood in the church's small front room, sun spilling through the single window, and said the words in low voices, steady and unadorned. Rosalie wore the same dress she'd arrived in. Vernon wore his cleanest shirt. The boys stood close, Gideon holding Garrett's hand. There was no ring, only the truth of it, spoken plain. Afterward, they rode back toward the lake, the wagon lighter somehow, though the supplies they'd bought filled the back. Rosalie sat close, her shoulder brushing Vernon's, her hand resting loosely atop his knee. At dusk, they reached the cabin. The fire was out, the hearth cold, but the door stood open like it was waiting for them. Inside, Vernon built the fire while Rosalie unpacked flour and salt, beans and dried apples. The boys curled up on the floor with their wind charms hanging from the rafters above them. When the flames caught, Rosalie looked across the room. "It feels like a home now," Vernon crossed to her. "It is." She stepped into his arms, her face against his collar, her breath warm against his chest. He held her as the fire crackled and the wind moved around the walls they had raised together. Neither of them said another word that night. They didn't need to. The peace was earned. The love quiet steady had taken root, and it would hold, through winter, through years. Through everything yet to come. The first snow came early, falling in soft silence while Rosalie shelled beans by lamplight and Vernon mended the latch on the cabin door. The boys pressed their palms to the glass, watching the flakes gather on the porch rail. It was a fine snow, not heavy yet, but enough to scent the air with wood smoke and hush the land all around. By morning, the world outside had gone still. The lake wore a thin skin of ice at its edges, and the pines held their white coats gently. Inside, warmth clung to the cabin walls. The fire had burned all night, and Vernon rose before daylight to keep it fed. He moved quietly, careful not to wake Rosalie or the boys. She had taken to sleeping with Garrett curled close, Gideon in the bedroll near the hearth. Vernon had offered to build a partition weeks back, but she had only said, "There's time." That morning, she stirred before sunup, drawing her shawl around her shoulders and joining him by the fire. He handed her a tin cup of chicory and sat beside her, their knees touching. Neither spoke for a while. The day didn't need words just yet. Rosalie broke the quiet first. "I dreamed we had a garden, rows of carrots and onions and those crooked little squash that grow too fast." He took a sip and rested his elbow on his knee. "We'll start planting come thaw. Soil looks fair around the southern slope. I want to try drying herbs next year, oregano, maybe sage, the kind that keeps well." He nodded. "We'll build shelves near the chimney, dry air'll help." She tucked her feet beneath herself. "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this." He glanced at her. "You regret it," her answer came without pause. "Not once." By mid-morning, Vernon and Gideon had strapped on their boots and gone to check the snares along the ridge. Rosalie stayed behind, helping Garrett sort through the sack of dried apples Vernon had traded for on his last supply run. They made hand pies together, Rosalie rolling the dough on the table while Garrett pressed the edges shut with a fork. While the pies baked, she stepped outside to shake the snow from the drying line. The cold bit at her cheeks, but the sun had come out, and the sky stretched blue and wide above the trees. She turned back toward the cabin and stood still for a moment, watching the smoke curl upward from the chimney, listening to Garrett's voice humming inside. A kind of peace settled in her chest, not the kind that came from stillness, but the kind earned by steady effort. When Vernon and Gideon returned, their boots were damp and their cheeks windburned. They carried 2 rabbits and a story about a weasel darting through a fallen log that left Garrett wide-eyed. That night, after the boys had eaten their fill and drifted to sleep, Vernon stepped outside to split a final stack of kindling, and Rosalie followed him, wrapping her arms around herself. "You ever think about what you want 5 years from now?" she asked as he brought the axe down clean. His answer was quiet but firm. "I want to see the boys grown and strong. I want to see you still standing beside me." She stepped closer, her breath fogging in the cold. "I want to teach again, not in a schoolhouse maybe, but here. There's enough to learn on this land. You'll teach them plenty. You already are." She touched his sleeve. "And you, what would make this more than just surviving?" He set the axe aside and looked at her fully. "You did that the day you stayed." Snow crunched under her feet as she reached up and cupped his jaw, her fingers cold and sure. "Then let's make it a life. Not just a season." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers, not rushed, not uncertain, but with the quiet gravity of a man who'd waited until the ground was firm beneath his feet. When they parted, she didn't step back. They spent that night in the same bed for the first time. The fire burned low, and the wind pressed gently against the walls they'd built together. No vows were spoken, but none were needed. Their hands found each other beneath the quilt, and the softness between them was not born of chance, but of every choice they'd made to arrive at this place. By spring, the garden was in. Rows marked by string and small stakes, seeds carefully pressed into warming soil. Vernon built Rosalie a table beside the window, where she laid out her books and pages for the lessons she gave the boys each morning. She taught them letters and numbers, but also how to read the sky, how to mark the seasons by birdsong and soil. Vernon finished the second room of the cabin that summer, a space for the boys to call their own. He carved their names into the doorframe and built them a shelf for their wind charms and carved animals. He didn't mention Alma anymore, but Rosalie sometimes caught his gaze linger on the lake at dusk, and she knew the past still lived in him, not as a wound, but as something he carried with reverence. One warm evening, she stood on the porch with her hands on her belly, quiet as the crickets chorused in the tall grass. Vernon came up behind her, arms around her waist, and pressed his lips to the place just beneath her ear. "You sure?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "I'm sure." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You were always meant to be here." Rosalie turned in his arms, forehead to his chest. "And you were always meant to be loved again." They stayed like that until the stars came out, 2 people who had known abandonment, who had come through failure and silence and long roads. But here, at this place of their making, they had found something unshakable years past. The garden grew. So did the boys. Rosalie gave birth to a daughter the following winter in the still hush of snow. Vernon held her before the cord was even cut, his hands steady, his face changed in a way Rosalie had never seen before. They named her Alma Grace. In time, the cabin became more than shelter. It became a place others knew by name. Neighbors came with trade, with stories, with children to learn their letters. And always, Rosalie was there, her hair threaded with silver, her voice strong, her hands never idle. Vernon never left again. His boots stayed near the door, his rifle above the hearth, his love steady as the seasons. And when the years bent their backs and softened their steps, they sat together on the porch, watching their children across the fields. They had not found their life all at once. They had built it, word by word, nail by nail, moment by moment, and it held. It held through every storm, through every season, and it was good.